The world is shifting, and America is being left behind. As Trump's brutal tariff war rages on, whispers turn into headlines. China and Europe, once wary rivals, now edging closer to economic partnership. And with every handshake, every backroom deal, the United States grows more isolated, more vulnerable. America's closest allies are drifting into the arms of its fiercest competitor. How did it come to this? And can the U.S. escape the trap it set for itself? Let's find out. The trade war ignites. How Trump's tariffs backfired globally. Donald Trump believed that tariffs would make America feared and respected again. Instead, they triggered a global firestorm that Washington could no longer contain. On April 2, 2025, Trump slapped a brutal 10% tariff on all imported goods, with devastating 145% penalties on Chinese imports and a punishing 25% on Canadian goods. The message was clear. America would bully its way to trade dominance, or else. But the world didn't buckle. It fought back. China responded instantly, slamming American goods with retaliatory tariffs reaching an eye-watering 245%. Europe, watching closely, paused its own retaliation for now, but prepared an arsenal of countermeasures targeting American products from soybeans to motorcycles. The OECD warned the American economy would slow to a crawl, hovering dangerously close to recession. Instead of isolating China, Trump had isolated himself. Across boardrooms and diplomatic summits, global leaders murmured the same phrase: if the US won't lead, we'll build a world without them. And for the first time in decades, that threat sounded real. China's power play, luring Europe into the economic battlefield. With America locked in conflict, China moved quickly to exploit the rift. Chinese President Xi Jinping launched a charm offensive, urging Europe to defend globalization and resist unilateral bullying from Washington. Meetings with European leaders like Spain's Pedro Sanchez turned into platforms to call for a new economic order, one where the US was no longer at the center. Social media exploded with claims that China was recruiting Europe for a united front against America. Chinese ambassadors openly invited European governments to oppose US economic abuse. In speeches, Beijing framed itself not as a rival, but as a partner, a bridge to stability. European companies, battered by US tariffs and fearful of Chinese dumping, faced a brutal choice: side with Trump's erratic America or pivot toward a massive Chinese market eager to absorb their goods. But in reality, trade deals were whispered. Supply chains shifted. Investments flowed. The seeds of a new global alignment were quietly being sown, and America was nowhere to be seen. Europe's gamble, flirting with Beijing amid US fury. Behind closed doors, European leaders weighed the risks. They knew the dangers of China's economic overreach, its dominance in clean tech, its brutal competition in automotive and steel markets. But the reality was brutal. The US was no longer a reliable partner. Trump's tariffs threatened to wreck Europe's fragile post-pandemic recovery. In public, EU officials like Ursula von der Leyen called for balance, insisting they wanted dialogue with both Washington and Beijing. But actions spoke louder than words. European companies quietly ramped up business with China. German automakers courted Chinese EV markets. French manufacturers sought new partnerships. Spanish and Italian officials spoke openly of strategic diversification away from US dependency. Meanwhile, Trump raged on social media, accusing Europe of betrayal. But the more he threatened, the faster Europe hedged its bets. To Brussels, the question wasn't loyalty, it was survival. And in a world reshaped by trade wars and shifting alliances, survival meant choosing the side that could offer the biggest market, the deepest pockets, and the least chaos. At least for now, that side wasn't America. Automotive Armageddon. America's industry feels the squeeze. The auto industry, once the crown jewel of American manufacturing, now lay in the crosshairs of global retaliation. Trump's tariffs didn't just raise prices, they shattered the intricate web of supply chains that had kept US factories humming for decades. Canada's 25% tariffs choked off vital parts. China's countermeasures slammed the door on US auto exports. Now, looming EU retaliation threatened to crush what little remained of America's automotive dominance. If Europe moved forward with tariffs on US-made vehicles, Detroit's big three, GM, Ford, and Stellantis, stood to lose billions. Ford's Mustang Mach-E, GM's Chevrolet models, Jeep exports, all faced the grim prospect of becoming luxury-priced in Europe's critical markets. Worse yet, Chinese automakers, locked out of the US by Trump's 145% tariffs, flooded Europe with cheap electric vehicles. European brands struggled to defend their turf. American brands already battered by supply disruptions and rising costs barely stood a chance. Inside auto plants across Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana, layoffs loomed. The fear was no longer theoretical. It was real, it was happening. And it was about to get much worse. The crumbling alliance, U.S. allies turn away. The United States once commanded an empire of alliances, an economic web that guaranteed its supremacy. But now, under the weight of Trump's chaotic tariff policies, that empire was fracturing. Canada struck first, imposing brutal tariffs and slashing American imports. Mexico expanded its trade deals with China. ASEAN countries, sensing opportunity, deepened ties with Beijing. Even Japan and South Korea, long-standing U.S. allies, quietly hedged their bets, inking side deals to protect themselves from America's economic turbulence. Europe, cornered by American unpredictability and Chinese opportunism, moved closer to a third way. A delicate dance balancing Washington's pressure with Beijing's allure. In capitals across the globe, the message became clear. America's dominance was no longer inevitable. Its leadership was no longer trusted. And for the first time in living memory, the world was preparing for a future where the U.S. wasn't at the center of power, but standing outside, raging at a system it could no longer control. Global isolation. Is this the beginning of America's economic fall? The consequences were no longer theoretical. U.S. growth projections cratered, with the OECD warning of near-zero expansion for 2025. Markets shuddered. Investment dried up. American industries, from agriculture to tech to autos, found themselves squeezed between retaliatory tariffs abroad and soaring production costs at home. The tariffs, meant to make America great again, had achieved the opposite, turning the U.S. into an isolated, angry giant, lashing out at an interconnected world it could no longer bend to its will. China rose, Europe adapted, even smaller economies carved out new niches. But America? It stumbled, hamstrung by its own policies, blinded by its own arrogance. The global order wasn't collapsing, it was evolving without the United States. And unless Washington changed course, the fall of America's economic empire wouldn't be a slow decline. It would be a sudden, spectacular collapse, one the world was already beginning to witness. In capitals across the globe, the message became clear. America's dominance was no longer inevitable. Its leadership was no longer trusted. And for the first time in living memory, the world was preparing for a future where the U.S. wasn't at the center of power. The world is shifting fast, and America is at risk of being left behind. As old alliances crumble and new powers rise, the cost of isolation is mounting. If you want the full truth behind the headlines, subscribe now and stay with us as we uncover the real battles shaping our future.